One Saturday evening, I was making tea in the kitchen when I heard a familiar knock at the door. Mark, as always, showed up at exactly 7, smiling and holding a lemon pie from his favorite bakery. I adored these evenings, ever since we became neighbors over 10 years ago. Saturdays had turned into our unspoken ritual, sharing desserts, telling stories, and simply being ourselves. Mark sat at the table, placing the pie between us, and glanced around the kitchen. "Did you change something?" he asked, nodding toward the newer pots by the window. "Added a little life," I replied, pouring tea. Luna, my loyal Labrador, trotted over to Mark, wagging her tail, and nudged his knee with her nose. "She knows who's boss here." He laughed, reaching out to pet her. We started chatting about the usual things. He talked about his recent trip to the hardware store, and I shared stories from the library. Luna settled at my feet, lazily observing us. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt off that evening. Mark was speaking more slowly than usual, as if carefully choosing his words. I noticed he was looking at his tea more than at me, and a few times he seemed about to say something but held back. It wasn't like him. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. He looked up, but quickly averted his eyes. "Just a lot on my mind lately," he said, cutting a slice of pie. I tried changing the subject, but his pensive mood lingered. After dinner, we moved to the porch. The evening air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and grass. Mark sat in the old rocking chair, and I settled across from him with my tea. "Have you ever wondered how life might have turned out if something had gone differently?" he suddenly asked. The question caught me off guard. I laughed to ease the tension, like if I'd become a gardener instead of a librarian, but Mark didn't smile. His gaze was serious, almost heavy. "No, not like that," he said softly. The silence between us was broken by Luna, who came over and nudged his hand. He leaned down to pet her, looking relaxed for a moment. "Sorry, I guess I'm just tired," he added, leaning back in the chair. I didn't press him, but his words stuck with me. After he left, I sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night. Luna lay next to me, her steady breathing offering some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had wanted to say something important. What had he stopped himself from saying, and why? The day after our strange conversation, I couldn't focus. In the library, it felt as if the books were staring at me rather than the other way around. Even Luna, who usually waited for me eagerly by the door when I returned home, seemed puzzled, as if sensing my unease. When Mark called that evening, his voice sounded more confident than the night before. "Want to go for a walk?" I thought Luna might enjoy a trip to the lighthouse. The lighthouse was just a 10-minute walk away, perched on a high hill with the best view of the ocean. I agreed, though I wasn't sure I was ready to face his odd questions again. Mark was waiting outside his house, leaning on the porch railing. He was in jeans and a plaid shirt, holding a leash for Luna, even though she knew the way perfectly well without it. "I figured we'd need this," he said with a smile. "She already knows the route," I replied. "Maybe, but it's a good excuse to ask you to join me." We walked in silence, listening to the waves crashing against the cliffs, while Luna dashed ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure we weren't lagging too far behind. The lighthouse loomed on the horizon, its white tower stark against the purple sky. Have you ever thought about how many stories this lighthouse must have witnessed? More than the two of us put together? Mark asked as we reached the top of the hill. "Probably," I said, sitting down on an old wooden bench. Mark sat beside me. For a few moments, we sat in silence, though it didn't feel awkward. Luna sniffed the grass nearby, while I let the sea breeze cool my skin. "Listen, Caroline," he began, avoiding my gaze. "I know I said some odd things yesterday. I've just been thinking a lot these past few months about what we have." I turned to look at him, but he kept staring into the distance. I want you to know you're more than just a neighbor or a friend to me. You're more. I don't know what to do about it, but I feel like it's time I said it. The words caught in my throat. I felt Luna nudge my hand with her nose, as if grounding me in the moment. Mark, I started, but he turned to me, his eyes full of emotion. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, he said gently. I just needed to let you know. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of something intangible lift from my shoulders. Slowly, I placed my hand over his. Mark smiled, and at that moment, Luna let out a loud bark, as if giving her approval. We both laughed, though the laughter soon faded. He leaned closer, and I felt my heart race. When our lips met, it was both unexpected and natural. The kiss was light, soft, but it carried a sincerity that made it feel like something we should have done long ago. As we pulled back, I looked at him and quietly said, I've thought about this too. Mark smiled again, and Luna barked once more, as if to seal the moment. We laughed, then sat in silence, watching the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A week later, Mark suggested we go to the fair in a nearby town. I agreed, though my thoughts were still occupied by the kiss by the lighthouse. Everything between us felt different since then. Closer, but also more tense. We hadn't talked about what had happened, but the sense that our old routines no longer fit lingered in the air. Mark picked me up on Saturday morning. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt, the one I always called his lucky day shirt. Luna jumped into the back of his pickup, eager for the adventure. Are you ready for the best apple cider in South Carolina? He asked with a grin. If it's as good as you say, it's worth trying, I replied, climbing into the truck. The fair was bustling with life, filled with the smells of fried food and the sounds of music coming from the rides. We wandered through rows of local goods, honey candles, hand-woven blankets. Mark stopped at a booth selling wooden carvings. Look, it's Luna, he exclaimed, pointing to a carved Labrador that, honestly, only resembled her in the shape of its tail. Well, if you insist, I laughed. He bought the figurine and handed it to me, then suddenly asked, have you ever felt like you're standing on the edge of something important? I froze. What do you mean? Us, he said, meeting my gaze directly. I didn't get the chance to respond. A huge storm cloud, which no one had noticed before, suddenly burst into a heavy downpour. People shouted, scrambling for shelter under the booths. Mark grabbed my hand and pulled us toward an old barn being used to store equipment. Inside, it was dark, the air damp with the scent of hay and wood. We stood there listening to the rain hammering on the roof. Luna, soaked, settled next to us and shook herself off, spraying water everywhere. At least we're dry, he said, running a hand through his wet hair. I laughed, feeling the tension between us start to melt away. Now we look like those wooden carvings, I joked, glancing at his drenched shirt. Mark stepped closer, his face lit only by the occasional flashes of lightning. Caroline, he said quietly, I know all of this might seem a little crazy, but I don't want to wait to figure out where this feeling might take us. He was so close I could smell the damp fabric of his shirt and the faint scent of his aftershave. Before I could say anything, he leaned in and kissed me. This kiss wasn't like the one at the lighthouse. It was deeper, more certain, as if Mark had decided exactly what he wanted and was finally ready to admit it. When he pulled away, I felt warmth spread through me, chasing away the chill of the storm. You know, I need some time, I said, smiling. We've got all the time we need, he replied. Luna barked, as if agreeing with him. And outside, the rain began to ease. I think we can head out now, he added, taking my hand. We stepped out of the barn, leaving the tension of the past behind us. The weeks after the fair were a real test for me. Mark and I were trying to figure out what our friendship would look like now that it had become something more. Every conversation, Every meeting was filled with a feeling I couldn't quite define. Luna, always by our side, seemed to notice the change too, as if she could sense that our looks and touches now carried a different meaning. One Sunday evening, Mark invited me over for dinner. Just a cozy evening, he'd said, but I felt it would be more than that. I brought a bottle of wine, and he cooked his signature meat pie, the smell of which filled his house with warmth and comfort. "I hope you still like it when I overdo the spices," he said as he pulled the pie out of the oven. "If I didn't, we'd have stopped eating together ages ago," I teased. We ate by candlelight, which was unusual for us. Our meals were typically casual. Plastic plates on the porch, with Luna skillfully coaxing us to share the leftovers. But this evening felt different. After dinner, we moved to the backyard, where Mark lit a small fire in the fire pit. Luna curled up by my feet, resting her head on my knee. He began, staring into the flames. I used to think nothing new would ever happen in my life. Everything felt predictable, like the pages of an old book. But then I realized, "You're the chapter one, keep rereading." His words took me by surprise. I had never thought of myself as someone who could change another person's life. But in his eyes, I saw a sincerity that made my heart race. "Mark," I began, unsure how to express what I felt. "I never thought I'd be able to let someone into my life again. After everything that's happened, I got used to being alone." He nodded. "I know what you mean. We've both been comfortable with solitude. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." At that moment, Luna lifted her head and looked at us with such a knowing expression that we both laughed. Her loyalty was so evident she felt like more than just a dog, a symbol of what tied us together. I placed my hand over his "I think you're right. Maybe we've spent too long seeing this as just a routine rather than something real." Mark squeezed my hand, his gaze soft yet steady. "That's all I wanted to hear." We sat by the fire until the flames began to die down. Luna fell asleep, curled up at our feet. The night was quiet, filled with the sounds of crickets and the scent of freshly cut grass. That evening, I realized I was no longer afraid of change. Mark and I were starting something new, unafraid of being held back by the past. We looked at each other, words no longer necessary, while Luna stayed by our side, reminding us that sometimes the best path forward is the one you choose together.